So quickly, before we switch over to the wrap up, I want to just mention, because I hear there's lots of questions about the recordings and the slides, they will be made available. So stay tuned. They'll be on the site that we have for this workshop. So so I think that wraps it up for now. This part of it, and I want to just thank all the speakers. They were fantastic talks, and I really appreciate the thoughtful discussions afterwards. I've learned, as I said, I've learned a lot. But right now I'm going to hand it over to Jeff Siegel, who is going to give a wrap up of all that we've learned today. So Jeff?
Great, thanks. So I sent in a slide. Could that be put on the screen?
Michael? Yep, perfect.
Well, that's happening. Excellent. Thank you. So first of all, I want to say that, the talks were all very excellent and contained a lot of nuance. So I'm not going to really be able to do justice to that. But what I wanted to do was kind of talk about some themes that cut across multiple talks that kind of come out of overall here, and acknowledge that this is imperfect because it's going to be brief. So the first thing in the kind of cartoon graphic there was a session on ambient transport to indoors and then indoor sources. And I think it's really important that even though we're talking about fine PM and indoor fine PM, that we're not just talking about PM, we're talking about precursors and things that might modify the fine PM itself, for example, the presence of condensable material. So we have those kind of two big categories. And then there were kind of several factors that influence indoor fine PM, and kind of group them into 5 very broad categories. But the important thing is, even though they're categorized, there's a lot of interrelationship. These are not kind of independent areas, but things that have multiple interplay with each other. So there's the situational factors, there's building factors, there's the activity patterns and the mobility patterns of the people who inhabit indoor environments. There's perceptions, both perceptions of what's important and also how those perceptions might modify behavior that then leads to changes in exposure and to even the concentration of fine PM. And there was a little bit of discussion about measurement factors and how those might influence kind of what we see of fine PM. So we have those factors that kind of cut across both indoor and ambient sources of PM. And then there were several research needs that were identified, and some of those that showed up in multiple talks are listed here. But before I get to those research needs, I think that there was this very strong overarching sentiment that, we're talking about indoor fine PM, but really what we should be talking about is addressing some of the underlying causes of exposure disparities, and frankly, addressing those causes. And a comment that came up in different ways, both in the chat as well as in a few of the talks, was this idea of kind of systemic solutions for systemic problems. And I think that's really what we should be thinking about when we're talking about research needs. In terms of kind of specific subjects, 2 or 3 talks, maybe more, mentioned this idea of exposure misclassification, because of the emphasis on or the amount, the body of research on ambient fine PM and ambient air pollution generally. And we kind of transport that to indoors without really looking at how that might change the exposure. There's this idea that came out a little bit in the last discussion as well as earlier, about developing health relevant metrics and looking at fine PM potentially from the lens of what matters to human health. There are a lot of details around some of the sink processes, some of the chemistry processes that we don't yet know a lot about indoors, and there's a lot of opportunity to add to knowledge there. For some, we do have some models and some model frameworks. I think that there's a need to look at some of the input parameters that we don't know, or maybe that we don't know very broadly, to be able to actually apply indoor models of fine PM in a general sense. And then several talks address this issue of composition. We know a lot more about the composition of ambient fine PM than we do about indoor PM, and in particular, understanding some of the drivers and impacts of fine PM. And then also there's obviously fine PM doesn't exist in a kind of box by itself. And one of the themes that came out in a couple of places was, what's the interaction between indoor fine PM and indoor microorganisms? And then the kind of last comment that I want to make is in the green box, is that a lot of the questions in the chat, as well as several of the threads that came throughout the talk, really point out reason why we're having 3 sessions here. And so in a week, there'll be the session on health effects and indoor exposure assessment that will address, I think, a lot of the themes, or be a continuation of a lot of the themes that came out here. And then, of course, we're fundamentally interested in mitigation. And so the session in 2 weeks will address practical mitigation, both the kind of technical side and the behavioral side. So that's the overall summary. And I guess I'll turn it over to Rich.
I am here, I promise, and I've been listening to all the presentations, and I'm absolutely thrilled by how our first session went today. Great presentations by everybody. Jeff, great wrap up. As always, very high quality wrap up. And I just want to thank everybody for who made presentations today, everybody who asked questions, everybody out there in Webland who listened in. I hope you learned something. I want to reinforce what Jeff just said, is that there were a lot of questions that were asked today that were really related to our sessions a week from now and 2 weeks from now. A week from now, it's going to be on health metrics and assessment, and 2 weeks from now on mitigation. And mitigation will include both technologies like portable air cleaners and filtration, but also human behavior and what occupants' buildings can do to try to reduce their own exposure. I also want to say that the results, or these sessions will be summarized, all 3 sessions today and the next 2 weeks, into a report that will be developed by the National Academies, and David, please correct me if I'm wrong, will be processed and published sometime in the summer. Is that correct? You can just put something in the chat if you'd like. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So with that, I want to, so David said yes, so that's good. I got that right. So, so I also want to thank Kim for being a great moderator today, and once again, the National Academies and the US EPA for sponsoring this workshop. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, and we'll see you in a week.